All right, we come to the book of 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to look at the next 3 verses. You younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Now remember that the first 4 verses of this chapter are addressed to the elders of the church. And Peter exhorts them to shepherd the flock of God among them, to exercise oversight, not under compulsion, but according to the will of God. Now he turns his attention from the elders of the church and he says, you younger men. So this is not the elders, these are the younger men of the church. And he says, likewise, because the elders had to be subject to the needs of the congregation. They had to subject their own desires to the needs of the congregation. So the elders were subject, in a sense, to the congregation. And Paul is saying, likewise, you younger men, you be subject to your elders. So the first command here is to be subject. Means to arrange in order under. It's a military term that talks about submission. Be willing to follow the directives and obey the orders of somebody else. Be subject to who? Your elders. So we've got 2 groups here. You younger men and your elders. And because of the context, I'm going to assume that Peter means here the same group of elders as he was speaking to in verses 1 to 4. The elders of the church. Younger men, be subject to your elders. That's the first directive to this group of people. And then he's got another one. And all of you. Okay, so here's another group that's given another command. And the command here is clothe yourselves with humility. Be humble. Toward who? Toward one another. That's talking about the church. The church is to clothe themselves with humility toward each other, rank themselves under one another, put the needs of each other before their own. And then he says, for, that should alert you. The word for gives a reason. And the reason is God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The humble here should be linked to humility. Clothe yourselves with humility. Why? Because God gives grace to those who are humble. He's going to oppose the proud, but the opposite of being proud is humble. God will give grace to the humble. So that's the second exhortation. The first, you younger men, be subject to your elders. Second one, all of you in the congregation, not just younger men, but all of you, clothe yourselves with humility. Be willing to lower yourselves, put others above yourselves. Do that toward one another, because God will oppose himself to those who are proud, but he's going to give grace to those who are humble. Therefore, based on what we've just said here, especially this line, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Because of that, humble yourselves. Now, this humility here, is it the same as the humility here? In this section, all of the believers in the church were to clothe themselves with humility toward one another. This time he says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. So it's in reference to God, not the church. They're to humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. That word tells us that a result is coming. What's the result of humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God? That he may exalt you at the proper time. Exalt you is the opposite of being humbled. If we will voluntarily humble ourselves under God's mighty hand, then God will lift us up. He will exalt us. And when does he do it? At the proper time. This isn't saying that he's going to do it right away. He's going to do it in his own good time, God's timing. And then he says, casting all your anxiety on him. This is how we are to humble ourselves. How do we do it? We do it by casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. That word anxiety, the word anxiety means cares. Remember, these believers were suffering. It was a suffering church. They had cares. They were anxious about what was going to happen to them because they were Christians and they weren't going to bow to the Roman government or burn the incense and say that Caesar was Lord. They weren't going to do it. So they were anxious. Cast all your cares on God. The word because tells us that the reason is coming up. Why? Because he cares for you. Cast all your cares on him because he cares for you. Now let's see if we can understand this section here about humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. How do you do that? By casting all your anxiety on him. The way they were to humble themselves was to take all of their cares about suffering and put them on God's shoulders. So what does it mean here to humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God? I submit to you that what he is saying here is that you need to be willing to submit yourself to God's providence and resign yourself to be willing to accept his will for you, his sovereign providential will for your life. If that includes suffering, then you need to be willing to accept that as part of God's will for your life. And as you do accept that, whatever God's will for your life happens to be, resign yourself to the will of God. You do that by taking the cares that arise in your heart and soul and cast them on the Lord. And you do that through prayer. You take your cares and you say, Lord, you take these cares. You worry instead of me. You take the cares that I'm feeling because you can handle this. You can give me the grace that I need. So here we have Peter's exhortation to a suffering church to humble themselves under God's mighty hand by submitting themselves, resigning themselves to God's will, and they do that by casting their cares on him so that he will get them through those difficult trials that they're facing. So may God help us to do the same thing whenever we have cares, to cast them on him and to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand instead of resisting his will and complaining about his will, accepting what the Lord has for us. So may God bless you.